why do I keep getting injured every year? Now, I have heard some version of this literally thousands of times at this point, which is, you know, every time I try and train for XYZ race, my knee gives out, or every year it's something when I try and train for a race, I get some injury, or I don't know, I guess I'm just one of those injury prone runners. And this is a super, super common scenario that a lot of runners find themselves in. It's a trap that I fell into in my first few years of running. So if this sounds familiar to you, then this is the episode for you. So what's happening here is that a runner is getting injured, usually every 6 to 12 months or so. Sometimes it's the same injury, sometimes it's a bunch of different injuries, but it's happening in the lead up to a race. So as the training load increases in the lead up to a race, they develop knee pain or Achilles pain or something, and that either stops them doing the race full stop because they are too badly injured, or they can't train to their full potential, or they can't race to their full potential, or they just can't enjoy the experience because the pain is limiting them. Now, when I say training load is increasing in the lead up to a race, your training load is made up of the training volume. So the volume of running you're doing, like how many kilometers per week, how many miles a week, and the intensity. So it's the combination of the volume and intensity. Intensity is like how fast you're doing those runs. Now, as you are building up to a race, let's say you're training for a half marathon, you might get a 3 or 4 month training plan that's going to build up your training volume and intensity to help prepare you to do that race. As the training load gets higher, something starts to hurt. Let's say it's your knee. So then you go to your local physical therapist, right? I would meet thousands of runners over the years who are 6 to 8 weeks out from their race. The training volume's going up, the training intensity is going up. The knee starts hurting, the Achilles starts hurting, the shin starts hurting, something starts hurting. So they come to physio to fix the problem. So in the physio clinic, you might get things like stretchers and massage and bracing and that kind of thing. You might go to your doctor, who might even propose in drastic situations doing like a steroid injection to really try and calm down the pain. But the common thread among all of these interventions is that they are all focused on reducing the pain, right? Said another way, they are all focused on treating the symptoms of the problem rather than the root cause of the problem, which would be, why do I have pain there in the first place? And this happens every year. So as the training load builds up in the lead up to the race, the injury comes on. Then either that runner manages to get through the race and do it, although they have pain that either interferes with their race or interferes with their training, or they have to pull out of the race because the injury is so bad that they can't keep up with the training and they think, well, I can't do this race anymore. So this was me for the first 5 years I was in running, and I wanted to do a marathon. Every time I would try and increase my training as I was following those 4-month training plans. As I would increase my training, the load would go up and I would get hurt. Usually my knee or my Achilles, or one time it was my shin, something would start hurting. I was then unable to continue the training, and I had to pull out of the race because I was nowhere near the fitness level needed to do the marathon. Now, in these scenarios, whether the runner is able to do the race, although being limited, or has to pull out of the race, one thing always happens, and that is after the race, the training load comes back down. And at that point, when the training load comes back down, the pain goes away. The knee stops hurting, the shin stops hurting, whatever it is, the pain goes away. Problem solved, right? Well, no, because 6 or 12 months later, when the training load increases again in the lead up to the next race, that pain comes back if it's the knee, or a different pain comes back. And that's because that runner never got to the root cause of the problem. And in this case, the root cause is that that runner lacks the training capacity to tolerate the training load that they are experiencing in the lead up to the races. So to try and unpack that a little bit, the training load is going up in the time just before the race, following the training plan, which is usually 3 or 4 months long, depending on the race. The training load goes up. The training capacity of the athlete is the capacity of that runner to tolerate stress, to tolerate training, and to adapt to it. And that capacity is limited to whatever extent. And when the training load exceeds the training capacity, then that runner will get pain, they will get injured. So the real problem here, and the reason that this keeps happening every 6 or 12 months, is that each year, at some point or more than one period during the year, there is a mismatch between the training load, which is high, and the training capacity of that runner, which is low. And that's why they get injured every year. And that's why I call them the perennially injured runner, right? So if you are a gardener, you know that you have some plants that are perennial because they come back every year, right? So that's what's happening here. The injuries are coming back every year or every 6 months when the training load goes up. Now, the way to fix this is not the way that most runners try to fix it, which is to go to PT, to do braces, to buy new shoes, to do injections, to do all of these things that are focused on reducing the pain once the pain is there. That is not the way to fix it, because the pain itself is not the problem. That's just a symptom of the problem. The real problem is that their training capacity is too low and their training load is too high. What they need to do is raise their training capacity so that it exceeds the training load, even when the training load is at its highest. So a couple of times a year when the training load goes up, they still have to have a training capacity that is higher than that so that they can tolerate that amount of training and adapt to it without getting injured. And the way to do this is to increase your training capacity a long time before you start the training program. So before the training load increases for the race, you raise your capacity. And I'm talking 9, 12, 18 months beforehand. That's when you can raise your capacity. And you raise your capacity so high that when the training load increases, as you start that more formal training plan that's in the 3 or 4 months prior to the race, you can handle it because you have the training capacity to do so. Now, if we are coming into winter 2024 as I'm recording this here in Canada. So if you were thinking I want to do a race in fall 2025, we're already too late. Okay, we're already behind schedule. We are really talking about quite a long time in advance working on raising your training capacity, not in the 3 to 4 months prior to your goal race when you ramp up that training load and just get yourself injured. And the real snag here is that after the race, whatever it is, when the pain has come on and they either got through the race or they didn't, whatever happens, the training load comes down, the pain goes away, and now they have no motivation to fix the real problem. They don't even know what the problem is. They think that it was just that my knee hurt when I trained for this half marathon. They don't realize that the reason the knee hurt is because their training capacity was too low. And they never take the steps necessary to fix that, to raise their training capacity so that the next time they do a harder training program, they can handle it. And that's why runners end up stuck in this cycle where they are perennially injured. Every 6 or 12 months, they get injured in the same place or a different place as they try and increase their training. Now, raising your training capacity is actually very simple. It's not easy, but it is very simple. And there's sort of two ways of approaching it. One would be like a more DIY way, and one would be working with like a coaching team, someone like us who would, help guide you through it. And I'll talk through the DIY way first, which is obviously like more limited and less sophisticated, but it might be a better place to start for you depending on your situation. So the way you might approach it is, let's say you were going to do a half marathon and you have a training plan that you've tried before, right? Or, you just download one from an app or from like a PDF online. And you look at the training plan. Instead of waiting till 3 or 4 months prior to the race to start that training plan, you're going to start it now when you have 12 or 18 months. But you're going to stretch that training plan out to twice as long. So if it's a 3-month plan, you're going to stretch it out to 6 months. And over those 6 months, you can do everything twice. So every week of training, you're going to do it twice. And that's going to allow you more time to adapt to the training load increase. And as you adapt to the increase in training load over that 6 months, your training capacity will increase as your body becomes stronger and more resilient and more able to handle training load. Now, in the sort of 3rd month of that training plan, right? So as you get towards the end of the training plan, you'll notice that the volume and intensity peaks, right? There's a sort of peak training load. And when you get there after 6 months, you have to stay there, right? You have to stay there for another 6, 12 months until you race. So you don't drop the training load back down. You raise it up to the highest point of the training plan, and then you stay there. Now, that's the DIY way. Okay, we do it when we are coaching our performance athletes, we do it in a slightly more sophisticated way. So we'll periodize the year when we'll work on different things, and we'll obviously customize it around their like holidays and schedule and lifestyle. Because when we're working with a runner, we want to make sure that we are creating a running training lifestyle as opposed to a running training plan, right? Because anyone can do something for 2 to 4 months, right? But if we want to do something for 20 to 40 years, then we have to have it, fit with our lifestyle. So that's where that customization comes in. So we take a more sophisticated approach, but in the end, it's the same goal, right? It's raise the training capacity by slowly increasing the training load to do so. And so for running in particular, that would mean, more running and higher intensity of running. For strength training, like more strength training and higher intensity of strength training. That's how you would raise that training capacity. Now, you might be thinking, I don't have time for all of that. When I train for my A race, if it's a half marathon, I print out my 3-month training plan. And during that time, I'm training twice as much as I normally do, or 3 times as much as I normally do. I can't keep that up all year round, year after year. And it's like, well, yeah, that's why you keep getting injured. Because every year there are a couple of months where your training load is really high as you're doing that training plan. And your training capacity is lower than that load that's applied. And when the training load is higher than your training capacity, then you'll get injured. And that's why it keeps happening every 6 or 12 months, because you've got into this pattern where you're routinely exceeding your own training capacity. Now, unfortunately, when we stretch this out long term, and I see this all the time, right? When I talk to runners now, when I used to work with runners in the clinic, I see this all the time. What happens as the years pass is that the perennially injured runner starts to get sick of being injured all the time. And what they'll do is that they'll reduce their training load, right? So when they're trying to build up the races, they'll not train as hard, they won't run as far, they'll register for shorter races, easier races, they'll make their goals smaller. They do all of this in an attempt to not hurt themselves. Unfortunately, what's also happening as they're sort of periodically or step by step, year by year, reducing that training load in order to not get hurt, what's happening is that they're also reducing their training capacity, because the body responds to what we do with it. So if we do less and less, it's capable of doing less and less. So as their training load is getting smaller, their training capacity is also getting smaller. And eventually, that runner has such a low training capacity that they can barely run at all, right? They're struggling to run a mile or two without pain or without some sort of injury flaring up. And this is what happens as the decades pass. I call that the danger of safety. And this is why so few runners keep running into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And if you don't believe me, the next time you go to a race, just look around at the relative proportion of runners in different age ranges. And what you'll notice is that the vast majority of runners at that race are middle-aged, and that there are very few runners in terms of percentage of people there who are in their twilight years, who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Most of the runners are in their middle-aged years. Only a small percentage are in their twilight years, which means that statistically, you are likely to quit at some point. So we all like to think that we'll be one of those runners who's still there in our 70s, 80s, and 90s. We look at those people and we admire them and we want to be like them. We want to be the great grandma or the grandma or granddad who's still running with their kids in their 80s and 90s. But statistically, chances are we won't be. The vast majority of runners will quit at some point in their 40s, 50s, or 60s and won't keep running into the latter years of their life. So while I, like you guys, like to think that in the year 2060 or whatever it is, I'm going to win my local half marathon 80 to 90 age group and be on the podium looking all wrinkly and old, I'm probably not, right? Statistically, at least, unless I do things to make sure that I do keep running. And that's what I'm talking about here. If we do want to keep running into our 90s, which if you're listening to this, I'm sure you do, then we have to earn it. And that's why I have so much respect for the runners in our community who are in those later age brackets, right? In their 70s, 80s, 90s, and are still training hard because they now have that health and vitality that their friends of a similar age range do not have, who marvel at how they are still able to do half marathons or marathons or 10Ks or 5Ks. Their friends look at them and envy them and think, how can they do that? How is that possible? And the reason it's possible is because they earned it over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of consistent training and consistently prioritizing themselves and their own health to make sure that they retain their independence and their athletic ability. And if you are one of those runners listening to this in your 70s, 80s, and 90s, and you're still going hard, training most days, and still pushing yourself in your races and in your events and in your challenges, then I salute you. I am a very big admirer of runners who are able to do that. And I very much aspire to do the same thing myself if I can. And if you are a middle-aged runner or a little bit younger, or even if you're a bit older, but you recognize this pattern, right? You're like, perennially injured runner, injured every year, injuries getting a bit more easy to come by, training getting a little bit lighter every year, running less, setting lower goals, right? If you see this pattern and you want some help to reverse that trend so that you can retain your independence and health long term, then I would love to help you with that. You can click the link in the description as usual, book a call with us, and we'll have a chat about what that might look like if you do want our help. Otherwise, my message for today is that if you are getting injured every year, it is not sufficient to just treat the pain using braces, manual therapy, injections, new shoes, whatever it is. You have to treat the root cause of the issue, which is that your training load is exceeding your training capacity, and you need to increase your training capacity if you want to be able to do those kind of events for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.